You're listening to episode 11 of the Confident Rider podcast with Jane Pike. Hello, fabulous human. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today, again on the Confident Rider podcast. Before we get into the specifics of this week's episode, I really wanted to extend a heartfelt thank you and a hug, because I'm a hugger, to those of you who have been listening and downloading and sharing and commenting and reviewing. It really makes my heart leap out of my chest every time I see something lovely written about the podcast, and especially to those of you who feel like you've gained something from it that has assisted your relationship with your horse. Thank you so much for taking the time. I always love to hear from you, and I really always appreciate the time you take to do that. So thank you. The next thing is this particular episode is a live clinic recording of a talk that I did at the Western States Horse Expo, and it's all about returning from injury. Now, due to the nature of this particular talk, what I mainly got into was the cognitive side or thought-based side of returning from injury. But what I want to discuss a little bit now is the somatic side of returning from injury, because that has been the ultimate game changer for me in understanding and recognizing trauma not only as a cognitive experience, but as a physical one. In the case of trauma, there is an arousal cycle that has not come to a natural completion. And what that leaves us in is a state of hypervigilance and reactivity. It can also lead to us unconsciously recreating patterns of behavior in order to see that cycle through to completion. So, in my understanding and experience, both personally and professionally, relief from this cycle and really making a full comeback and return from injury comes from addressing both aspects. The psychological one, yes, but also the somatic and the physical one. Just to give you a little bit more background about trauma and what it is that I'm talking about right now, there are certain things that need to happen in order for us to have an experience that feels like a memory. So when we have something that's happened in the past and it flashes back into our mind, we recognize that as something that has happened in the past. We recognize that as a memory. And that is because our hippocampus timestamps and encodes experiences so that we're able to recognize them on this timeline. In the case of trauma, the hippocampus essentially goes offline. So what happens is that the body's natural defenses have been overwhelmed. It's been too fast or too intense for us to be able to process and deal with what's happened in the moment. And as a consequence, those memories become fragmented. They become distant from an ability to have an understanding of them as a memory. They don't get encoded, they don't get timestamped. And so that continues to be experienced physically as if it's happening in the present moment, because we've never sufficiently metabolized and filed away that energy. This is a really important understanding because trauma and injury comeback is something that we have a felt sense of. It can be something that exists very separately to our conscious understanding. All of us have had experiences, be they little or big, where we have gone into a situation and had a physical memory of that situation come up by way of a feeling or an intuition or a sensation that is separate or completely, there may be no thought process attached to that at all. So the body doesn't lie. Basically, we store these experiences energetically in our system, and if we haven't found ways to finish that cycle and to complete that arousal cycle to the place where we've come back to rest and relaxation, then we are constantly seeking out ways to do that. And that can be in healthy and unhealthy ways. This talk is primarily concerned with the cognitive or the psychological side of things, and the reason that I chose to focus primarily on that in this particular session is just because of time limitations. I have a short period of time to get some information across, and I really want that to be something that people can go away with and start to action. In my actual work and in my membership program, I'm just about to release a new pathway this week called Comeback, which is all about recovering from trauma. And in there, we are dealing with the cognitive and psychological aspects which relate to anticipation anxiety, to really being able to get on top of your thoughts and take those to a more constructive place, but also really renegotiating our nervous system and renegotiating that felt sense of what injury and trauma feels like. So it's a fascinating topic. If you have been in the midst of trauma, and all of us have had some kind of trauma at some form in our lives or some time in our lives, then I think this is going to be really interesting for you. And if you are in a position where your experience of trauma or attempting to come back from something feels limited and you feel stuck, come and join me in my membership program. Let me help you, because there are ways that we can work through this and get you to a much better feeling space. The thing to understand about trauma is that it is not what happens to us, it's what happens inside of us. So your traumatic experience can be something that may be seemingly inconsequential to someone else, but the meaning that you've attached to it and the way that you've processed that physically means that it's holding you back in some way. So let's get into it now. Really looking forward to hearing your thoughts, and thank you again for taking the time to hang out today. Today's topic is developing the mindset that you need to recover from injury or from trauma. And what I'm really curious to know is this a topic that specifically relates to some of you here? Like, is there anyone that is pretty keenly aware for this? Yeah, okay, cool. So I'm really open to questions and anything really that you want to do to make this as interactive as possible. I figure, milk me for all it's worth if there's something that I can help you with, because that's really my greatest pleasure, to be able to make it practically based. What we can start with is really just gaining a better understanding of what happens to us when we're injured on a psychological level and what it means to be traumatized by something. And I think that what commonly is occurring at the moment in terms of the conversations that we hear and the words that are spun around is that trauma is an overused word, where we're like, oh, it was so traumatic, or it was really, I found that to be such a traumatic experience. And the differential that I want to make at this point is that there is a difference between something that is stressful and something that is traumatic. And what we're doing is we're interchanging those two words just culturally. So if we find something stressful, we might describe ourselves as being traumatized. The difference between those two things is if you are stressed and you remove the stressor, the stress goes away. If you are traumatized and you remove the stressor, the trauma remains. Because trauma is a form of trapped energy. It's a somatic and physiological reaction as well as a psychological reaction. And I'm going to break down those two parts, and for the sake of actually giving you something to go away with that you can practically apply, we're going to focus more on the psychological aspect of what happens to you during injury and how to overcome that with your own writing. But what I'd really like you to understand is there is a physiological process to go through as well. And let's break that down a little bit now. So if you can think about being as trauma, and we're going to use trauma for the after effect of injury, okay? So the thing that happens with any injury is that it's very individually dependent how we actually store that information. So you can be traumatized, genuinely traumatized by something which someone else might perceive as fairly inconsequential. So there can be a lot of lacking compassion or lacking empathy from people around you who may not understand your own personal experience with the event that you've gone through. And that is because there's a huge spectrum of what trauma looks like for you and how it manifests in your day-to-day and how it manifests in your writing. So if we can think of trauma as being an altered state of consciousness, and the reason that it's an altered state of consciousness is basically thinking back to us as cavemen for a minute, and this is what animals are actually really good at and what we've lost the ability to do, is that if I was escaping from a tiger right now, okay, so I've got a tiger running up behind me, and what happens is my body goes into survival mode. So the key elements of survival mode that we are really familiar with are fight, flight, and flee, right, or freeze. Those are the most common ones that we know and that are talked about, and in fact are the reactions. And we can see them in our horses as well. You know, some of them have a higher propensity for a flight reaction. Some of them have a higher propensity for a freeze reaction. You know, there's like a default response when they feel like the pressure's gone too far and they can't protect themselves. We have this as well. This is our response to trauma. So in a healthy trauma cycle, we would run from the tiger, we would have this huge burst of adrenaline and cortisol that comes into the system. And you can hear stories of like superhuman strength at these points, you know, like they lifted the car off the baby, or they did things where it's like, I don't even know how that happened, but I was amazing. And you're like, because you were primed in like that survival mode. And so let's say that you manage to outrun the tiger, or you manage to do something which leads you to safety. And you've gone through this peak, so the threat has been there, you've had this physiological reaction which sends you into overdrive, you're primed for, you know, the blood is, everything is being directed to places which allow you to go away, to escape, you're adrenalized, you're full of cortisol, and then all of a sudden you come back to rest, and you come back down, and the cycle is completed, yeah? So that's a full trauma cycle where you experience the peak and you experience the release. When we are traumatized, we have been stuck in the middle of that cycle and we are still at the peak, okay? That is because we have been unable to prevent the situation or to exert some control over it. And so physiologically, we are stuck in the trauma response. Does that make sense? We haven't actually completed the cycle. And so you see people, and just to sort of move away from the actual horse experience, but you see people seeking out traumatic experiences, you know, people who've gone through really bad times and it seems that they almost attract it because they're trying to find ways unconsciously of completing that cycle. So if you can think of trauma as being basically, you have had this huge influx of energy come into your system and that energy is now stuck. It hasn't released. And so you're in a heightened state of hyperarousal. You know, maybe you can't sleep, maybe you're finding yourself being overly anxious. It's because you're in this place where you peaked and you peaked and you peaked and you've never come back down. So horse riding accidents are really commonly experienced in this way because it's really fast and we haven't been able to help ourselves. So there's a feeling of like learned helplessness that comes off the back of it. And then that feeling of being out of control becomes something that we really want to avoid. So we start to control our circumstances that we feel like we can control to every possible extent. And then we try to control our horses. And then we avoid putting ourselves in situations where we feel like we possibly might get out of control because that just is too risky. That's like the worst fear that we can imagine. So this trauma cycle, part of it has to involve some kind of physiological release of the energy. And the reason that we're, excuse my language, crap at this is because we really don't like being out of control. So a normal shock reaction would be to shake, yeah? So that's a very healthy response to shock. That is your nervous system filtering out all of that energy, but we don't like it. We're afraid of it. We're afraid of unconscious reactions of our body that are outside of our conscious control. So in many cases, we shut down the normal response to trauma in an effort to make things okay because we don't want to feel like we're out of control. Does that make sense? So I'll give you a really good example of this, which when I learned about this, I was like, I've actually inadvertently killed a lot of birds. And that is because at home we have so many birds around us and they fly into the windows sometimes. So flying into the window is like a shock, and then they come down and they're in that freeze reaction, which is quite a common experience for a bird. And then when they come out of it, they discharge that energy by shaking. And if you allow them to actually tremble and shake, they come through the trauma cycle and then fly off. But I've rescued them and been like, it's okay, you don't have to shake. and then they don't discharge the energy, and then they stay in shock, and then they die. So I realised that through my love and empathy, I've been killing a lot of birds by interrupting the process because I didn't like their response to trauma and felt like that meant something that was actually a very healthy response to the trauma cycle. Does this make sense? It's really important to understand because I think that we don't really have a grasp on what it means and that we're afraid of it. So that's part of the arousal cycle. The other thing that commonly happens with injury, and I think if any of you have been injured, this is perhaps, and I've been injured as well, so I really understand this. We fear that we're no longer going to be the same, that we're not going to be the same. The injury has happened and it's like a grief because we're like, I want to do all the things that I used to do and used to be, and now I feel like this thing has changed that. And it divides our life up into a before and after story. Before my accident, I was doing this, and after my accident, I was doing this. And holding on to that fear that we are somehow out of control of that change is really scary and immobilizing. And it stops us from making the decisions or taking the kinds of actions that we would normally make in order to progress us. So we kind of freeze frame ourselves in time physiologically and psychologically. What I want to tell you is you're absolutely right. You're not going to be the same. You're not the same. You are changed, but you actually might be better. You might be better than you were before. Because trauma and injury is an incredibly life-changing experience to go through. And it can be like an alchemy if you let it. But what we really are afraid of is change inherently. We want things to stay permanent. We want things to be the same. We want to be able to control them. And grief of any sort, it's not something that you leave behind. You know, and why I mention grief is because it is a type of grief. It's a grief for the person that you were before and that you're afraid that you're no longer going to be. And a grief for anyone, be that yourself or someone else, you don't leave that grief behind. Like if you've lost a horse or if you've lost a person in your life, you don't leave that, you don't get over it. You have to take it with you. And I think this is the same approach. It's like, I'm going to take this experience with me and I'm going to allow it to inform how it is I am moving forward. But I'm going to allow it to be an inspiration and expression of what I become now, as I'm going to use it in a creative capacity rather than a defining capacity, yeah? So this is the mindset that we have to get into. We have to understand that we are operating on a timeline, okay? And so let's pretend that everything that is to the left of me right now is my past. This is my past. Everything to the right is my future. And let's pretend that this lectern, or whatever you want to call it, some cute horses over there, it's fine to take a minute just to ogle them, is the present moment. So what we do is say that my left-hand side, my past has been full of amazing experiences and some pretty ones that I'd kind of like to forget. And maybe there was a big injury in there that's like a big tree sticking up on my timeline there. So instead of actually being in this moment and going, well, let's have a look at everything that's happened here and use this in a creative capacity, we kind of take everything forward now and we observe it in the present moment as like a big mound of stuff, and we use it as a predictor for what's going to come, yeah? And when we've been injured, this is especially prevalent. We feel like that injury has a predictive quality for what's going to happen coming forward. But instead, you want to say that your present moment is only everything catching up. It's basically the present manifestation of everything that came before, yeah? But that doesn't mean that it has to be the predictor of anything moving forward unless you let it be that way. So the way to view things, and this is my new favourite word, is with hindsight. Instead of like beating yourself up and going, I should have done this, I should have done that, I should have been this or that, you're like, what can I take from that? And what can I learn from that? Because if you think about it, the greatest teachers that you're ever going to learn from are teachers that have been through some stuff. Like, they get it. They really get it. And that's because they've been there with you, not because they have done it all right and it's all worked really well. And that's a decision to view something from a different perspective. Everything is about the meaning or the perception that you attach to it. So memory in and of itself is not a real representation of what happened. It's your perception of what happened. And so you have this opportunity to attach a meaning to something that allows you to either be empowered or disempowered. And you can make that decision and then allow that to have a creative quality moving forward. But that's really, really important. And it's also important to understand how we function from an actual anxiety perspective in that way, which we're going to get into in a little bit of time as well. So is there any questions about that so far? Yeah, so the question was, like, why is it that you can have ridden like 1,000,000 times and everything went well, and then one time it went to crap, and that's what you focus on the whole time? So the answer to that is that we are hardwired for the negative, basically, and the reason for that is because we want to survive. If you can think about that, the whole purpose of your thought process is not to work against you, but actually to protect you. So we're never working against ourselves. It might feel like it, but unconsciously there's always some reason as to why we would have those negative thoughts. And the reason for that is you believe that highlighting that as a flashing light in your mind will somehow protect you from that happening again in the future. So it basically, anything with a strong emotional charge creates a strong mental impression. And the negative ones are so strong because we really, really, really want to avoid that happening again in the future. The other thing is that neurons that fire together wire together, meaning that you might have fallen off or got injured once, but I bet you've thought about it thousands of times in your mind. And according to your unconscious mind, it cannot tell the difference between what is real and imagined. And so on an unconscious level, you've fallen off or done whatever you did in your mind enough times for that to feel like it's been a lived experience. Does that make sense? So you don't want to beat yourself up about these things because we're kind of like, I was going to swear, it's not good, but we are wired in that way. We are wired in that way. It's a self-protective mechanism. But if you can get into the habit of flipping it around and thinking, okay, I can see what it is that I don't want, but I'm going to use that to motivate what it is that I do want. So if I don't want my horse to spook or shy or do this, this and this, then what I do want is for them to be calm and relaxed, and that's what it is that I'm going to focus on. Some of you might have been to a couple of the talks yesterday, but I'm going to run this by you again because it's really important. Our minds can't move away from something. They can only move towards something, okay? So if I say to you, I don't want you to picture a blue tree, and I don't want you to picture green grass under the blue tree, and definitely don't picture the yellow bird in the blue tree, what happens? You picture the blue tree and the grass and the yellow bird because it's impossible for you to not picture something. You can only picture something else. Does that make sense? So you can't move away from something, you can only move towards something. You can't move away from fear, you can only move towards calmness and relaxation. So when you go out, the first thing that happens on just a very basic level is to start to ask yourself some really high quality questions. This is skipping ahead, but I think it will tie it in now. High quality questions are questions which are solution focused and which lead you towards an answer. And I'll give you an example. Say I've had a ride and I've fallen off. And I might not have got injured, but I've hurt myself, and it's enough for me to feel a little bit apprehensive the next time round. So I'm going out there to work with my horse and I say, I really don't want to do this today. Why does this always happen to me? I feel like I just can't do it. Like, what is going on here? So why does this always happen to me is an example of a really low quality question. It's a low quality question because it gives you a low quality answer. Your mind and your thoughts are always wanting to make you right? You always want to be right. So if I say to myself, why does this always happen to me? My mind goes, let's think on that. Maybe it always happens to you because you're useless. Or maybe it always happens to you because you don't really know what you're doing. Or maybe it happens to you because you don't know as much as everyone else. So you can see how you breed this conversation by asking yourself crappy questions. You get a crappy answer. An example of a high quality question would be, what could I do today to get me moving forward? Or what does my horse need from me right now? Or what's the one thing I can do to get me into a better space? And you might even not know the answer. That's not the point. But you start to search for the answer. And you think, well, one thing I could do to get me moving forward is actually like go into the arena. And then the next thing I could do is just like hang out with my horse for a while until I feel the energy levels come down a little bit. Can you see where I'm going with this? But it creates a whole different sense of possibility. And that narrative creates a whole different feeling base, which motivates a whole different set of actions. So let's go into it a little bit now. Did anyone come to my talk on anxiety yesterday? A few? Yeah. I know your smiling face. You were my favourite out there. Yeah. And you laughed at all my jokes, which I really appreciate. Yeah. Kindred spirit. I can use the world's sexiest accent line again now because there's only a few. Yeah. New Zealand won the world's sexiest accent, just putting it out there. Okay, so managed to say that in every session so far. Right, so moving back to the topic. Returning from injury. So what we need to understand is how our body responds to anxiety, or how our body responds to fear and stress. And the reason that we need to understand this is because it will help you reframe what it is you're experiencing in the moment, because it can kind of suck. So when you're in any situation, let's say that you haven't had the accident but you're about to, right? Your mind takes in all its information via the senses. So we're like scanning agents, like the Matrix. We're looking at what's happening around us visually. We can hear things, we can feel things, and we're scanning our information constantly for something that might be an emotional or mental trigger that could cause us harm, right? So nothing bad has happened to me ever at the Western States Horse Expo. So when I'm looking around right now, my mind's going, you're good, you're good. And I might be feeling anxious, but that's only because all of this information has come to my thalamus, which is basically like the road traffic controller in our mind. So it goes, right, nothing obvious here that we need to panic about. We're going to send all that information to your cortex. And it's like, over here, right, got that. And then the cortex goes, okay, we've got this information. This is the 5 different scenarios we could see possible come off the back of this information. So basically your cortex is your anticipation centre. It is your reasoning and perception centre. It's what decides what might happen as a result of this information. So I could come into this and say, I've got a talk coming up, I've never been here before and I've got a funny accent, and my cortex might go, well, they might sit there and be like, she's got no idea what she's talking about, and I could focus on that and kind of feel bad about life. Or I could go, someone could get something out of it and that could make me feel good. It's all these imagined scenarios which come up. Now, your cortex is also your ability to change or modify behaviour. So it takes in information and you can say, I know I used to feel anxious about this, but I'm going to choose to feel different, yeah? That's the decision that's made in your cortex. Now, in the case of an accident or injury, your unconscious mind scans your environment for something which is able to be linked into that moment, so you don't have to think about that moment again. It can go straight to the emergency response and get you out of there, yeah? So this is why you can be in a situation where maybe you've had a fall. Let's pretend you're a hunter jumper and you've had a fall at a jump. You didn't particularly injure yourself, but when you fell, there was like a red trot pole on the ground here. And you go to have a lesson with an instructor and you ride in and you see a red trot pole, and consciously it doesn't mean anything, but all of a sudden you feel completely overwhelmed with anxiety. That is because your amygdala has stored that red trot pole as an emotional anchor or memory that tells your nervous system you need to get out of there, so you do not have to go through the process of wasting time in order to save yourself, yeah? Now, this is the same situation that tells us we don't want to put our hand on a hot stove, we don't want to step in the fire, we don't want to get rid of this. But the flaw in the system is sometimes it's not logical. It's just linked up arbitrary things in the environment that cause us to have this traumatic or stressful reaction, yeah? That's why you might hear about like a veteran, a Vietnam War veteran, all of a sudden smells the same smell of soap he had in the shower at the time he was in combat, and he's taken back to the field. It's an anchor that tells him that he needs to be aware or be afraid for some reason. So when you're injured, we create these emotional anchors that can link us to our horse even, so it might be that horse that causes you to have this reaction, or that particular thing that you do, or an indoor arena. You're fine in the outside, but the indoor arenas freak you out. Thank you. Yep. It's a big point. It was a big point. So And that is because you have an emotional memory that's linked to a specific situation. Now, the thing to remember is that it's not the end of the world. It doesn't mean that you're always going to experience this anxiety or emotional response. But what it does mean is you need to expose yourself to the same trigger and train your mind to associate a different reaction to it. Does that make sense? So you have to put yourself in the pathway of the fear or in the pathway of the anxiety and stay there for long enough in order for your mind to create a different association or response. And this is going to be one of the key things to do when you're coming back from injury. So the first mindset shift with that is this anxiety is useful and necessary. This fear is useful and necessary. This is not something that I have to be afraid of. This is just my mind alerting me to a situation that has unnecessarily linked up because at one time in the past I was injured as a result of this specific activity, but I know that I'm safe now. Yeah? So just because you feel anxious and afraid does not mean you are not safe, but it feels like you are. It feels like you're not safe. So I'm going to presume that you've taken the messages from whatever it is that you've experienced and done the legwork on some kind of behavioural and training lesson with your horse. That's what I want to flag up in the first instance. So that if you've had an accident or an injury where your horse has displayed some kind of behavioural concern or upset and that hasn't been addressed, you aren't safe. You aren't safe. That you have a valid fear there. But if the fear isn't valid, if you're like, my horse is fine, I know that I can do this, but I feel disproportionately unsafe, this is the situation that we're talking about, yeah? So the process of recreating that association is, there are two ways. You can throw yourself in the deep end. You can be like, just get out there and do this, which works for a certain type of person, but I wouldn't do it myself because it's like torture. But if you want to, you can do it. But what you have to do is give yourself some skills when you're out there. You need to be able to arm yourself with the skills to basically bring yourself down in the moment, because the sole purpose of this renegotiation of the pathway is that you need to stay with the anxiety until it lessens by 50%. So think of that as like the general rule of thumb. So if I was to get on and ask myself, what score would I give to my fear or panic right now? And I would say, 0 is like, I'm totally sweet, there's nothing there at all. 10 is like, I'm already in China. So now it's 9. Let's say it's a 9. Like I would do anything to get off right now. I just want to get out of here. So it's like, okay, we're not going to do anything. You don't have to walk, you don't have to do anything. You might have someone there holding your horse, but you're going to stay in the saddle and do like some breathing exercises, things that we can talk about, until we say that feeling's about a 4 or a 5. And then you can get off and go. You don't have to do anything else. But the other thing to remember off the back of this is that if you leave the scene of the crime while you are in the anxiety response, you will reinforce the anxiety response. And this is why it builds on itself. You know, like if you avoid it, and the avoidance will cause it to magnify as well, because you might not have physically gone there, but you've mentally gone there and then you've stopped yourself from going there. So it's like, I was right. You know, you've got something to be afraid of. So the first thing to check is that you're safe. I'm not suggesting if you're not physically safe to do this. The second thing is to recognise that your anxiety is necessary and useful right now. That this is just your brain telling you that this situation is not safe, but it's not real. It's not real. You are safe. So that's something that you can even just repeat to yourself. I'm safe right now. I don't feel safe, but I'm safe. I'm safe right now. And you can keep saying that and we'll go through a breath practice until you lessen it by 50% and then you get off. So the progressive process of desensitization, if you like, or reassociation, that might be a better way of thinking about it, is to actually incrementally break things down. And there's a lot of ways to break it down. So one thing that happens at this point is you feel like you should be a lot further along than you are. and then you don't give yourself the time to actually rehabilitate, because that's essentially what's happening. You're mentally rehabilitating. You may not be physically, but mentally. And so some of the roadblocks are people around you at this point. They're like, just get on with it, or get on, oh God, is she ever going to ride again? And like all those, like, so not helpful right now, hashtag bugger off. So if you can think that point 0 is the point that you're super comfortable at. So you're like, what am I super comfortable doing right now? Well, and it might be, I'm super comfortable going to the paddock and catching my horse. Like that, I'm super comfortable at that. That doesn't push my buttons at all. That's in my comfort zone. And that might be one person. And so what I want you to do is pick a point 0 and a point 100. Point 0 is the point that you're really comfortable at. And then the halfway point, the 50% point, is what's the thing that makes me anxious doing, but I'm able to do it anyway? I don't feel good about it. I feel anxious, but I can still do it. That, to me, is the point that represents the marker of you teetering on the edge of your comfort zone. Like you're kind of outside of it. You can still do the thing, but emotionally it feels like kind of a big deal. Does that make sense? Yeah. So then I want you to think of, at that point, what's the next step? What would be one step out of that? So it could be, and this will vary for everyone, you know, like it might be you're super comfortable walk, trot, canter, gallop, but you can't jump a course. Or it might be super comfortable on the ground, but as soon as I get on, I'm freaking out. Like, it doesn't matter what it is. But your point, the first point is, where do I notice that anxiety come up? So that's like, we know that you're on the cusp of your comfort zone there. And then what's one step outside of that? What would be the next thing along? And so you start to practice in that place where you start to emotionally self-regulate in the place where you're already in your comfort zone, but outside of it. Because the skills that you develop need to be developed while the environment supports you, yeah? You don't want to be in that place where you're already in the survival zone, practicing the things to keep you out of the survival zone. You want to make sure that you're able to do this when you're kind of okay, you know? And then when you establish some skills, and we can talk about a breath that I like to work with in this place, then you can start to expand your comfort zone and come back. But you don't have to stay there for long. This is the other thing. Like, we think in blocks. It's like we do this, and then we do this, and then we do this. But actually you can do this, and then you can come back, and you can do this, and then you come back. I call it intentional practice. So intentional practice in any given format. I use this in the competition prep pathway, in all the different pathways. This isn't just for fear. It's like, what is it that I'm avoiding that's hard for me right now that is the thing that I need to practice? And it might be, you know, that specific canter movement, or like doing the pirouette, or doing that jump, or doing the side pass is really hard. So instead of being like, right, I'm going to get in there and side pass for an hour, it's like, within this hour session that we have, you know, just talking generally, I want to make sure that I've sort of hit that 3 times. So there's a start point of intentional practice where I'm like, this really maxes me out physically and mentally and emotionally. I'm going to go there with my horse, and then we're going to take the pressure off. And we're just going to do it for a few minutes, and then we're going to do something which we're good at. So it's like a heart rate monitor, you know, the peaks and the troughs. That's what your practice wants to be like. You want to do something which extends you, and then you come back. And you do something that extends you, and then you come back. Because if we're doing this, what tends to happen is that we have a thought, or we have a response to something that creates a little bit of tension. And so you might go, like, it's just in you, it's not much, but it's kind of in you. And if you keep going and that's not released, and you have another little bit of up, you're kind of going up the scale, till it feels like you've done something which is very similar to everything else you've done, but all of a sudden the lid's blown off, and you're like, get me out of here. It's because you haven't ever had the release in between the points of tension increase. So think about it that way with your practice as well. It's like you want to intentionally practice doing the things that are currently outside of your comfort zone for periods of time in between the things that are inside your comfort zone, so you can start to renegotiate those associations, elasticize your comfort zone, but not take yourself so far that you're in the survival zone all the time. Because it's not sustainable. Nobody wants to go there and be miserable for the whole time. It's just not, it's not fun. And it's not helpful. That's the other thing, it's not helpful. So this reframing of saying, like, okay, let's recognise where we're successful, and it might be just catching our horse and leading them around. And that's fine, but start to do that consistently, because the thing that we tend to do is like all or nothing. You know, like all of a sudden we just stay away from them, or they're just sitting in the paddock. It's like, if you can catch your horse and bring them in and tie them up and brush them, and that's your comfort zone, do that every day. That's your ride. But then you start to just edge to the next bit. What about putting the saddle on? And for some people that I've worked with, that's terrifying, because there's been a moment where something's happened there and that's the thing. So it's like, okay, well, let's just get the saddle blanket out. Do you call it saddle blanket? Yeah. Saddle blanket out. Warwick was telling me, they're like, they don't wash up here. Like, washing up is washing their hands. And I'm like, they think you wash your hands a lot. And I was like, oh, I used a washing up example. So washing the dishes is what I meant to say. Sorry, totally off topic. But, you know, that thing of like putting a saddle blanket over might be the thing that is the thing. So just introduce that and do it until it becomes not a thing anymore. Because the only reason that something is outside your comfort zone is because it's outside your comfort zone. You know, it is going to be uncomfortable. And I think that what we get deluded into thinking is that we wait to feel good until we do something. You're not going to feel good. That's the reality. You will feel good at some point, but it's always going to be new level, new devil. Do you know what I mean? Like, because your comfort zone expands, and there will be things within your comfort zone now which were totally, you know, outside of it before. You think back about things that a year ago might have concerned you that now it's just like part of your thing. But there's another thing on the horizon that looms forward, and so you're not special or unique in that. That's the same for all of us. So let's do a quick recap then. Your anxiety is necessary and your fear is necessary. If you've had an accident which has caused your mind to register some kind of fear or threat, the reality is you're going to kick into self-protective mode, and you're going to feel that when you get out there. And that's okay. We all do that. There's nothing wrong with you. You're not flawed, and it doesn't mean that you can't be the same or better than you were before. It's just a natural reaction, a natural protective reaction of your body. It doesn't mean that it's real. You can remind yourself that you're safe. And the way to do it is to start to break down or make an incremental plan to move you forward that starts at the point of, where is my comfort zone? The next point is, what is something that is just on the edge of my comfort zone, and I know that that is it because I feel a sense of anxiety, but I'm still able to do the thing. So that'll be like in a lesson when someone goes, I don't want to do it, but I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it. And that's your, you know, that's the thing. And then what is one step beyond that? And those three things will constantly be shifting. They will shift. The other thing to recognise is that as human beings, we like certainty. And so we get addicted to our feelings, even if they're not serving us, yeah? So if you have spent long enough in anxiety or long enough in fear or long enough being attached to your injury or trauma, you can actually do things to sabotage your movement forward because that represents your new comfort zone. Yeah, it's like a magnetic pull. Basically, if you've set your internal thermostat at a certain level of feeling, that's like your level of homeostasis that you get used to operating at. And as soon as you challenge that in either direction, you naturally, as just part of the law of physics, get pulled back to that homeostasis point. So the Itty Bitty Shitty Committee is likely to come up and say to you, are you sure about this? Like, we don't really think you should be doing this. Because that mechanism is concerned with you surviving, but not thriving. That's a really important differential. So all of us, our comfort zone would be like for me, I mean, I work in a little office in a garden on the South Island of New Zealand where there's like no one really around. And if I stay there, well, even if I stay there, the Itty Bitty Shitty Committee gets up, but they're like, you shouldn't go online. God, shut down that video. But you can see how we create this story about the situation that can really limit us moving forward. So safety is kind of like an illusion in and of itself. Like the roof could fall on my head. I don't want that to happen, but that could happen, you know, like those sorts of things. So the second point and I'm going to talk a little bit about this afternoon because I've got a session with Warwick Schiller, is that if you can become mindful of the ember of the emotion. So what I mean by that is, what often happens is that we go out to our horse and we have like the flame of the emotion come up. It might be anxiety, it might be fear, it might be apprehension or concern. And you register it, yeah? It's like, so that's the flicker of the emotion. And then instead of being aware of that and observing it and allowing it to flow, we create a story. We add to it. And that's what causes the emotion to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So your awareness is actually to register the emotion but not exaggerate it. It's okay to feel anxious, it's okay to feel fearful, and I can register that, but then I don't have to make a story about what that means. And often it's the story that we add to the feeling that magnifies the situation, that makes it feel completely impossible. Yeah? It stops you from going forward. And the beauty of this practice is you can do it here, everywhere, anywhere you are. You can observe how it is that you feel without adding to it, without labeling it or calling it something, and just be like, well, that's interesting. That's interesting that I feel like that. And you don't have to let it go any further. Does that, the story, we inflate things through what it is that we add to it. Okay, so if we were to go out there with our horses, and one thing that was really important to us was that we were in our body, should we do, some of you will have done this already, but for the sake of those of you who haven't, do you want to do a little breath practice with me that's really useful? Yeah? We'll do I apologise for those of you who've already done this with me, but it's good to do again. So this is what I call the balanced breath meditation. And your centre, the seat of your centre exists about 4 fingers below your belly button, yeah? So if you were to really centre yourself and walk around, that's about the centre of your balance. And any kind of martial arts or yoga practice or anything, that's where the breath originates and returns to. So I want you to pretend, this is imagined, that from the seat of your centre to just below your throat is a channel, and it's hollow, yeah? So there's a hollow channel, and within that channel there's a ball. And it can be whatever ball you want. It can be like a ping pong ball, it could be a ball of light, it could be a fluffy pink ball. Knock yourself out with what that ball looks like. So when we are feeling really calm, that seat of balance, the ball sits in the base of our tummy, yeah, sits at the centre. And what I want you to do is, if you feel anxious or upset or off kilter, I want you to register where the feeling sits in your body in relation to that channel. So for most of us, actually we won't generalise like that. Sometimes if you're really afraid, it'll be in your throat or in your chest, and there's that constriction, it's very high, yeah? And if you're a little bit unsettled, maybe you're just like, it's just in my belly, like I feel a little bit unease in my belly. And so you locate the feeling, and then I want you to imagine that wherever that feeling sits, the ball is sitting, yeah? So your sole aim is to get the ball back down to the seat of balance. It's like one of those wind, when they blow the wind down and the ball comes down? And the way that you do that is with your exhalation. So with every exhalation, you imagine the ball pushing back down to your centre. And from experience, I know when you feel really off kilter, it might take a while to even shift the ball in your imagination. It just feels like it's not going, or it might pop back up. And that's okay. There's no attachment to what it does. It's just that that's your aim, to get it back down to your seat of balance. And you can practice it anytime you feel emotionally ruffled. That's what I want you, when I want you to practice it. Because that means that you're in situations where you're not really feeling compromised, but you've started to develop a skill that allows you to register where the emotion sits in your body and manipulate it to positive benefit. And then when you get on your horse, like what I do any time, this is just part of the emotional transition that I do at the start of a session, is I get on my horse and I just sit. And I let them sit, which is beneficial for them as well. But I imagine or check in with where it is that I'm feeling any tension. And I just use the breath until I've got the ball back to that space. And I don't start until I've got to that place. And then you might walk around and notice that actually your focus goes off and you feel a little bit apprehensive. And it's just a really good way to come back to feeling your own body and being in charge of it. And taking something which is really intangible and giving it some kind of solidity that you can actually work with, which is always really beneficial. So that's one of the breath practices that I really like working with, and that gives you the chance to do it. The thing to remember as well is that every time you have a thought, so let's think of it this way. I like to think of thoughts as invitations. This is what really helped me. I think of everything that I'm imagining as an invitation for me to experience that. And when I think of it that way, it makes it really clear about what thoughts I want to give energy to and what thoughts I don't. So if I'm imagining an accident or I'm imagining the worst case scenario with my horse, I think to myself, do I want to invite that into my experience or not? And if I don't do anything about it. I don't have to fear it or squash it down. I'm just going to let you go, and I'm going to sit with the seed of that, the ember of that, but I'm not going to exaggerate it, and I'm going to just allow the next thing to come in. And that's where any practices of mindfulness or meditation are so valuable, because you recognize a space that exists between you and your thoughts. And when you're in a fearful space or an anxious space, we actually fuse our thoughts. It's called cognitive fusion, which is where we have a thought and we don't even recognize that we influenced that or created that thought. We immediately dive into the thought and we see it as true, or we feel it as true. So cognitive fusion, we want to introduce some cognitive diffusion, which is I am here and I am having a thought, but I am not my thoughts, And if you're like a butterfly catcher, if you were to imagine that each of your thoughts were butterflies, you're like, do I want to catch that one or do I not want to catch that one? And you don't actually have to do anything about it, because if you were to sit and watch your thoughts for long enough, you recognize that they're just moving along like the clouds. You don't have to stop them or change them, but you can just feed the ones that you want to experience, So you then put yourself in the empowered place of actually creating a thought process, as opposed to reacting to the ones that you're having and feeling like you have no control over it, which is part of that traumatic process as well. That's it for us today. Thank you again for taking the time to hang out. If you're interested in working together and really getting yourself to a good feeling space that is integrated and connected and allows you to really be present with your horse, jump onto my website and check out my membership program, confidentrider.online/joyride. I would love to have you join me. If you enjoyed this episode, let me know what you took away from it. Feel free to share on your favourite social media channels, or if you're feeling particularly inspired, leave a review. They were always really appreciated. That aside, I look forward to hanging out with you next week. Have a fabulous day, and I'll see you on the flip side.